Okay, everyone. So this is our next English session. It says chapters 7 to 9, but we're not actually using all of them. So we're going to be using specifically chapter 9, but obviously I don't want you to miss out on all of the other chapters in the book because it's just so interesting. Okay, so this is chapter 7, and unfortunately, I couldn't attach all of the pages after Mummy had left. We got a letter telling us she had made arrangements for all four of us to join her in England. My voice. It was during the August school holidays, and Sandra and I hugged and danced specific words in front of us. Our prayers had been answered. We were on our way to being one big happy family again. This button here, the time leading up to our departure was a hive of activity. We had 2 weeks in which to pack and say goodbye to everyone. Auntie and Uncle started being really nice to us. I suppose they wanted us to tell our parents how good they had been to us. This wasn't true, of course, but I forgave them. I would forgive anyone anything because I was so happy. I couldn't sleep at night. I was too restless with excitement. At that moment in time, I had no sad thoughts about leaving my country behind, even though I might not see it again for a very long time. Nothing occupied my mind and thoughts except for being part of a family again. Finally, the day of our journey across the ocean came. My mother had asked her sister Olive to buy the tickets for all four of us. Auntie Olive lived in the port of Spain, which was where we had to board the ship for England. We spent our final nights with her before being packed into her car for the drive through the busy evening traffic to the port. I had been there before to wave goodbye to Dardy when he left the country, but now it was my turn to leave these tropical shores for the first time in my life. I was just about to begin a journey of a lifetime, which would take 15 days across 4,000 miles of ocean. The excitement at the port gave me a tingle inside. I felt butterflies in my tummy. I could see the big ship far out in the water. It couldn't come right up to the side of the wharf because the water wasn't deep enough, so everyone had to be transported to the ship in small motorboats. There was so much noise it was deafening. Everyone was pushing and shoving. People were shouting, making sure their trunks and suitcases were safe as the boats ferried backwards and forwards. I felt bewildered, lost among the other passengers and those who had come to bid farewell. Many were hugging and crying as they said goodbye. Prayers were being said for a safe passage. Suddenly I started to cry too. I felt scared, but of what I wasn't sure. Perhaps it was because I now realised what was about to happen. I was leaving my homeland, the land where I had experienced great happiness with my family. Maybe it was because I was frightened of going into the small boat as it bobbed on the dark, oily water. Water which crazily reflected the harsh harbour lights like a liquid mirror and separated us from the waiting ship that seemed to be calling me to her. Maybe I was just scared of facing the unknown. I still don't know. Eventually, I managed to get into the boat after being coaxed along with Lester, Ellington and Sandra. We all held on to each other tightly and just about managed to wave to Auntie Olive before the roar of the engine drowned out our goodbyes. She looked smaller and smaller as the boat left the quayside and neared the enormous ship. I became even more anxious, and I realised that we were on our own, 4 young children without anyone to reassure, comfort and protect us. My thoughts were interrupted as the boat bumped against the side of the ship, alerting me to another challenge that loomed in the shape of a shaky rope ladder on the side of the ship, which we had to climb. I really thought I was going to fall into the deep dark water. My heart thumped and my knees went weak, but encouraged by the sailors, I made my way up the ladder. At last I reached the waiting hands of the sailors, who hoisted me onto the deck. I had made it. Everyone was on board, and I heard the loud clanking sound of the anchor being winched up, and thundering noise bellowed out of the huge ship's funnel, and we started to move, slipping gently and quietly into the darkness. I'd never been out of the country before, but as I stood on the deck of the ship that was about to take me on the longest journey of my life, I smiled. This was the beginning of my great adventure, my new life. I turned and looked back at the port lights twinkling in the distance. I looked for the last time at Trinidad and said a silent goodbye. Okay, so that was chapter 7. So we're just going to move on to the next slide where I read chapter 8. Okay, chapter 8. The big Spanish ship, which had already picked up passengers from Granada and Barbados, was like a floating skyscraper with stairs, numbers, letters and arrows pointing in every direction. On our ticket was a number and a letter, which were called out, and we were told to gather together with the rest of the passengers with similar numbers. We were then taken down into the belly of the ship to a tiny cabin with 2 bunk beds and a sink in the corner. Our cases were already piled up under the small porthole. This was to be our home for over 2 weeks. We climbed into bed, exhausted, and fell fast asleep. The next morning I woke up feeling as if someone had beaten me over the head. I felt dizzy and nauseous. I had never had this feeling before. Sandra said she felt the same. We both rushed to the basin to be sick. The only relief was to stay in bed, or to crawl up to the deck and stand perfectly still while breathing in the sea air. I remember being given tomato soup and corn puffs to eat, which I was told would make me feel better, but they only made me feel even more sick. I still can't stand the sight of either. This was a disappointing start to my adventure, not the way I had expected it to begin. The seasickness lasted for about 4 days. On the 5th morning I felt surprisingly better. My body and head had got used to the ship's motion. I had gained my sea legs. Sandra still hadn't completely discovered hers. She had been given the responsibility of looking after us and making sure we behaved. Lester and Ellington and I tended to be a little wild in celebrating our newfound freedom, and our antics made her anxious, but we weren't at all sympathetic to her predicament. We made a terrible noise and ran all over the crowded ship, exploring all 3 decks, including the shaded one where many of the passengers sat relaxing, reading and playing cards. We discovered every nook and cranny on board the ship, and sometimes went into places we shouldn't have, even deep down in the 2 cargo holds which were packed with goods bound for Europe. There were many other children who were enjoying the freedom of the ship, and some, like us, had no adult supervision. Even though Marmee had paid the shipping company for someone to keep an eye on us, no one ever did. As a result, sometimes things got out of hand. One day Ellington had a fight with another boy on the deck. It started off as a rough and tumble, then it began to get out of control, and while Sandra and I pleaded for them to stop, they rolled closer and closer to the edge of the deck. Nearer to the guardrail, I thought they were going to fall into the deep Atlantic Ocean. Suddenly, from high above, a voice called for them to stop. It was the captain, who was watching the fight from his bridge. The last thing he wanted was children overboard, but the fight still kept going. Ellington was not the sort of boy to give in. The helmsman heeled the ship sharply over, which made us feel disoriented, but still the fight kept going. Then the captain himself came down from the bridge and dragged the boys onto the deck, just as they were about to fall in. He warned them both that if they couldn't behave, they would have to stay in their cabins for the rest of the voyage. The experience was frightening and shook us all, so after that the atmosphere and the journey became a little more controlled, and we behaved less dangerously, although we were still adventurous. One evening at sunset, when the sea looked like waves of liquid gold, we saw the most amazing sight. Suddenly, as if by magic, the sea erupted with hundreds of arched shapes, which dived back into the water. None of us had ever seen anything like it before. Then we realised that it was a shoal of flying fish, dancing and skipping across the ocean. We watched the glittering spectacle until the sun died down and disappeared below the horizon. We became friends with the Spanish sailors who cooked the meals down in the galley. There were hundreds of passengers on board to be fed and plenty of food to prepare. Mountains of potatoes had to be peeled every day, and the sailors entrusted us with that duty. At the time, we thought this was because we were their friends. It was only later that I realised they had only held us around because we were doing their job for them. Each day, a diet of soup, tasteless meat or fish with little flavour and potatoes was served. Although we helped prepare it, we didn't eat it. I think we mostly lived on bread, water and canned fruit, the only food we found edible. The adults all seemed to enjoy being on the ship. They were always laughing and having fun. For them, it was like being on a cruise. They were all accustomed to working hard for a living, and for 2 weeks they had all the food, drink and nightlife they wanted. At night, we used to sneak up on deck in our pyjamas and watch them dancing in the ballroom to the music. Many of the sailors also joined in with the socialising in the evening. One night we saw one of our sailor friends hugging and kissing a lady while they were dancing. We stared wide-eyed and drop-jawed at them for a while as they smooched together. We then giggled and ran back to our cabin with our secret. We left behind the hot tropics and entered the warm Mediterranean, where we stopped off in Spain. The sailors unloaded some of the cargo that the vessel was carrying. As we watched from the deck, I overheard some of the adults saying they wished that they could go ashore to see what Spain was like. That's how I knew it was Spain. No one on board really wanted the voyage to end. It was a passage in time, laden with freedom and happiness, free of care and responsibilities. We were journeying toward the unknown. We all had romantic visions of what it was going to be like in England, but still didn't want this part of our adventure to end. To tell the truth, I hadn't thought of Marmee, Dardy, or of seeing my brother and sister in England since the start of the journey. It was only 2 or 3 days after we left Spain that these thoughts entered my head. Now everyone started talking about the big arrival, and a buzz of excitement was going around the ship. I knew we were getting closer to England because the weather started to get much, much colder, and the sun seemed to disappear under the low clouds. Marmee had written and told us that the place where we were coming to was not as hot and sunny as in Trinidad. I now knew what she meant. Still, we kept warm by running around the ship frantically. Walking never occurred to us. The day before we arrived, there was an announcement that told everyone to pack their belongings. Nothing was to be left behind. We didn't have much, so it didn't take us very long. That evening after dinner, there was a big party at which everyone celebrated the end of the voyage. Life at sea was coming to a close, but the memories of coming to England would linger forever. Okay, and that was chapter 8, Life at Sea. So if we carry on into the next slide, we're going to look at chapter 9. That's the most important chapter for today's session. On 1st of September 1960, I woke up to the sound of seagulls. Watery morning light flooded through the porthole. We had gone to bed late the night before, after all the party revelling, so we were a little slow in reacting that morning. As always, Sandra was the first out of bed. "I can see England!" she shouted. The rest of us scrambled up and pelted to the porthole. She was right. There was land ahoy. I couldn't see much of it, but it didn't matter. It was England. We had arrived. What joy! We hugged and danced around the cabin. Our dreams were coming true. The first thing to do was to make ourselves presentable for our arrival. We ran to the communal shower room and washed at breakneck speed. Marmee always told us it was essential to have a fresh body and clean underwear, especially on important occasions. Today was one of the most important of our lives. I plaited Sandra's hair and my own. I was always good at plaiting, even at an early age, and on this occasion I plaited her hair extra special and decorated it with ribbons, just like Marmee would have done. We had had beautiful dresses made for us, which we put on proudly. Together with white shoes, socks and gloves, Lester and Ellington looked dashing in their brand new outfits too. We all looked quite regal. No prince or princess could have felt better. By now the packed ship had made her way up to the English Channel and was gliding slowly up the Solent towards Southampton. All the decks were crowded with a massive amount of luggage, as well as our fellow passengers who, like us, were dressed in their finery. The men in their baggy trousered and wide-shouldered suits with stylish trilby hats, the ladies spruced up in colourful dresses with masses of crinoline under the skirts, and of course hats and gloves were a must. Arriving at the port seemed to take forever. The excitement was overwhelming and everyone began to get very anxious. Lester was convinced the land was an iceberg, which we were about to crash into. Apparently someone in Trinidad had told them England was as cold as an iceberg, so the nearer and colder it got, the more convinced he became that this was true. Sandra and I did our best to comfort him, but secretly we both felt anxious and nervous about what was ahead of us. We stood on the deck trembling with cold, but also with a little fear. The anxiety grew greater as we travelled cautiously into the dock, passing dozens of terminal sheds. In front of some sheds, cargo and passenger ships were moored close to each other along the quayside. The docks were a hive of activity, nothing like the small shallow one we had departed from in Trinidad. There were cranes, cargo boxes, and people everywhere. The terminal sheds were barn-like buildings with long corrugated iron roofs, which seemed to squat on the concrete wharf. In a few of the buildings we could see passengers who had arrived before us on their ships. Over and over, I kept asking myself when this floating vessel was going to come to rest. Surely it wouldn't take the whole day to dock. We seemed so close, but yet so far. At long last the ship appeared to be getting closer to the quay. I could see hundreds of faces looking up at us, trying to spot their loved ones. I looked desperately for Marmee, hoping I would recognise her lovely face amongst the crowd. Suddenly there she was, beaming with joy like an angel, waving frantically at us. She clutched her bosom and seemed to shake her head with a sigh of relief, as if to say, "Thank goodness my children are safe." Then she started to wipe away tears with her handkerchief, and motioned us to stay where we were, which was not really a problem, as the four of us couldn't move. We were too numbed with excitement. There was a man beside her who was not my father. I could see her talking to him and pointing us out. Eventually, when the ship was anchored, he came on board up the gangway. He made his way over to us and introduced himself. He was a social worker whose job it was to meet passengers as they arrived and help those who needed advice about how to get to their new destination. Not everyone had friends or family to meet them on arrival, so the social worker was essential. He looked after us because Marmee was not allowed to come on board, and as we were children travelling alone, he took charge of us. He bundled all of our luggage together and swiftly pushed past the other passengers, the 4 of us in tow behind him. My heart pounded loudly like thunder as I climbed down the gangplank, this time not with fear but with joy as I ran towards Marmee. We all made a dash for her and hugged her. She squeezed us so tightly and I felt I would break. The love and joy that passed through every bit of our bodies was overwhelming. I was at last in paradise, clutching Marmee. I never wanted to be away from her again. When we finally broke loose from her, she opened a bag and took out something for each of us. "I thought you might be a little cold," she said, "so I got these for you." She handed me a powder blue knitted Marks and Spencer's buttoned front cardigan, embroidered with pink and yellow flowers. It was gorgeous. I adored it. My first English present. I squeezed it affectionately. I felt as if I had been sprinkled with magic dust, and that all my dreams were coming true. I was back with my beloved Marmee at long last. Okay, so we're going to be thinking about our first-hand experiences now. So an event where you might have felt the same as how Floella felt in that chapter, or in the subsequent, or in the chapters that we've read, where she felt quite nervous. So she was extremely nervous and anxious before and during her journey to England. I want you to pause the video here, and I just want you to think of a time where you may have felt similar or the same as Floella did at that point. So just pause the video here. Okay, now when she finally did arrive, she didn't have to be nervous because everything turned out great in the end. So she saw her mum and she just sort of forgot everything that had happened. She was just so excited to see her family. She wasn't nervous anymore. She was just so happy. Okay, did your experience that you were thinking of, did that turn out okay in the end? And how did you try to overcome your nervousness and your anxiousness? What did you do to try and overcome that? So again, pause the video here and just have a couple of minutes, a minute or so, to think about the answers to those questions. Okay, so your task, you are going to write a letter to Floella. In your letter, you'll need to explain that you're writing to her to explain about a time when you might have felt the same way as she did during her journey. So you're going to be comparing her experience to your own experience. So how can you share the same feelings as her, even though your experiences are different? It's quite a tricky question because she went through something that some of you, or a lot of you, would never have experienced, moving across the sea to a completely different country where she didn't know anyone, she didn't even know the country, and that's quite a big thing. So how could you share the same feelings as her, even though your experiences are different? Just want you to pause there and have a think. Okay, so we're thinking about how our experiences are really valid, okay? Her experiences, although different, can have similar feelings to how we feel just in our general everyday life. So on the next page, I've done a letter example for you to have a look at before you think about writing your own. Okay, so this is my letter example. You can use some of it just as a starter, just to think about the kind of things that you might begin to write to Floella about. So, dear Floella, my name is Miss Lorenko. After reading about your experiences when travelling across the seas to England, I felt compelled to write to you. I wanted to describe to you a time when I felt the same way as you did, and can sympathise with how scared and nervous you may have felt. When I was younger, I moved schools in the middle of the year, and although it's not the same as travelling all the way across the sea, it was still a very scary experience. I moved to a completely different county in England with my parents. You must have felt even more nervous travelling without yours. We moved so that we could live in a much better area and into a bigger house. I felt extremely sad about leaving all of my wonderful friends. I kept thinking about my new school and would wonder if I would make friends in the same way as at my old school. Would they like me? Would they think I was different to them? My mum and dad told me that everything would be fine as long as I was myself and that I would always make friends. Okay, and I've got the ... there because that would be a continuation. We'd carry on that letter. So you're going to be thinking about how you can compare your experience to Floella. So you will have to keep going back to what she's been through and how she felt, and then talking about your experience and how you felt. Okay, this is just an informal letter, so there's no need for an address or anything like that. But I really want you to think about how Floella may have felt during her time across the sea, and actually a really good time where you may have felt really similar to that.